but it's been my great fortune to be on the organising committee for this event, and now it's the third year that I've been doing this, and I can honestly say that every year that we do it, it gets more enjoyable. I see more friendly faces that are familiar and faces that I know or come to know over the next week. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the first plenary learning lab, which is going to be delivered by our Elsira colleagues, Bahvani, Shankar and Edward Joy. And this learning lab is going to look at some of the ways in which environment can be integrated, or environmental factors can be integrated into agriculture and nutrition research.
My name is Edward Joy. I'm Assistant Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm going to talk very briefly today about integrating environment into agriculture and nutrition research. I'm going to start by looking at some of the whys of why do we integrate environment into agriculture and nutrition research. And then a quick look at some of the methods, some of the hows, how do we go about doing this. It's a mixture of quite high-level stuff and some deep dives, quick dives into the methods. This chart shows years of life expectancy on the y-axis and income, GDP per capita on the x-axis, and the blobs are different countries. And I've just highlighted here Ghana for obvious reasons, and the United Kingdom, and also India as a comparison. And this is an animation, and what you'll see is as it runs through the years from 1901 up to the present day, you'll see the blobs moving as countries get wealthier and as life expectancy increases. And this is pretty much universal around the world. You might have seen a little dip in 1914, which was obviously the First World War. And this is 2018 now. So the world is almost unrecognizable compared to 1901 in terms of wealth and in terms of life expectancy. And one of the main reasons why life expectancy has increased has been because we've been able to feed more people, better diets. So here's one indication of nutritional status here for India and for Ghana. It's a little bit more legible from data here from 1988 up to the present day. And the percentage of children who are low weight for age. So we've seen declines like this around the world. We've seen more children being better fed. So that's been the one of the major success stories in terms of health and nutrition over the last century or so. One of the effects of our ability to improve, or what's happened as we've been able to grow more food for more people, we've had to draw more on natural resources, and we've had a greater effect on natural systems that support agriculture. So here you can see the carbon dioxide equivalent tonnage emissions, cumulative emissions, again Ghana, India and United Kingdom on a logarithmic scale. That's running from 1900 up to the present day. So agriculture is one of the major contributors to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, producing 20 to 30% of emissions currently. So as we've produced more food and all sorts of other activities around the world, we've increased our carbon dioxide emissions. We've also drawn tremendously on freshwater resources, and that's been really important, a really important part of the story of how we've been able to feed more people and feed them more and better food. But just to give you an example of the increase in water use that's gone on in agriculture, here again, Ghana, United Kingdom and India. Now Ghana and United Kingdom, there's not much irrigation that goes on in agriculture. In India, it's a different story. 90% of the freshwater usage in India is for agriculture. And India, as I'm sure you know, went through a green revolution in the 1960s, 1970s, high-yielding crop varieties. To get these high yields, you needed more inputs, more nitrogen fertilizers and more irrigation. It's been a success story in terms of the food production and and food security, ability to feed people, but it has required greater usage of natural resources such as water. And here, this is an image. If you go on Google Earth and look around the Amazon, it's quite typical. This is a series of images I put together starting in the 1970s, I think it was, going up to pretty much the present day. 1980s up to the present day. Satellite image of what used to be pristine Amazon rainforest, And as you see, gradually over the years, gets fragmented. Huge tracts of land are cleared for agriculture. So we've been able to feed more people around the world. We've been able to feed them better diets. But it's also required us to make greater use of the natural resources, and arguably at an unsustainable rate. But why do we integrate environments into agriculture and nutrition research? Well, I think the main driving factor is that we need to consider the environment and the natural resources if we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to need to carry on producing more food. The population continues to grow. We're going to need to carry on producing more nutritious diets around the world, but we're going to have to do this with a lower environmental footprint. So in terms of linking food systems, environment, and health, we've just had a quick look there at the interdependency of food systems and the environment. We need the environment, obviously, to produce food for as long as we're growing the majority of our food outdoors in soil, relying on rainfall and irrigation, relying on fairly consistent climate. That was a little bit of dependency for the farmers. Food systems are clearly linked to the environment. We also know, of course, food systems are linked to health, production of nutritious diets and so on. Not really the subject of today's session, but we know also that the environment is linked to health. We think of air quality, for example, water quality, and so on. So we know these three areas are related, and there's been an increasing attempt, I guess, by the research community to try and look at these linkages, to look at these interdependencies. And in recognition of these links, there's a new field of research that's growing up that really focuses on drawing together these different domains of research and focusing on the linkages. And there's a new set of methods that have been developed or shaped to fit this, the challenge of bringing together these different disciplines and so on. We looked just now at the linkages between food system activities, the production of food, and the effect on the environment. But how do we actually go about, what are the methods that we're using to link between these different domains? So this is where we go from the high level into just a quick look at some of the details, some of the methods, just as an example. When we do this kind of research, we normally start, I think it's fair to say we normally start with wanting to know something about what people are eating. So we'll define our population, and we'll try and we'll ask the question, what is this population eating? We need some kind of dietary data, and that might be available at the individual level. We might have some kind of close proxy for dietary intake from household consumption and expenditure surveys, that sort of thing. And we might, in the absence of those data, we might turn to FAO international data, so providing a measure of food availability or food supply at the national level for countries around the world. And this gives a fantastic longitudinal data set as well. We also need to know something about what happens at the crop production stage or the livestock production stage. We need to know something about the management practices, something about the environment in which the crop has been grown, and therefore something about the resource use that's gone into producing that crop and the emissions from the activities. And where do we go for this kind of data? Well, we normally turn to secondary data sets. And here is the homepage of the Water Footprint Network, for example, which provides a data set of water usage in the production of crop items and livestock items around the world, different scales, different types of water use as well, whether it's water that's come from precipitation or from irrigation. Here, for example, the labels have dropped off this. This is, I think, potatoes in blue, rice in orange, and dairy in grey. So kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of product. This has just come from the FAO website as well. So again, this will be at a national level for FAO data typically. But over a longitudinal, get great longitudinal data sets. And here, another example of where you might turn to for secondary data on emissions, in this case, associated with food production. This is the Cool Farm tool developed by some of our collaborators at the University of Aberdeen. And this is a bottom-up approach, so it's looking at farm-level management data, farm-level activities, farm-level yields, and so on, and coming up with an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of crop production. So these are our two main data sets that we need to link: what people are eating and what happens at the food production stage. And to link those two, we need to know about the movement of the food, where the food has come from. We like to trace back as accurately as we can with spatial and temporal resolution from how did the food get to the plate. And we'd like to know something about the processing. I'll come back to this in a minute. Why do we need to know where the food has come from? Well, one of the obvious reasons is because the production environment is very different in different areas of the world. And therefore, the resource use in the production of food will vary tremendously depending on where that food is being produced. This map here shows the amount of irrigation water used in the production of wheat in India. And the dark blue colors there, you're looking at between 2.4 and 3 liters of fresh water coming from irrigation per gram of wheat produced. And in the light blue areas, you might be less than 1 liter of irrigation water per gram of wheat produced. Obviously, within those states, there's tremendous variation as well. But sometimes there can be quite consistent spatial variation. And so when we know where food has come from, we can attach a more relevant and more accurate environmental impact. But not only that, this map here shows the baseline water stress across India. So here, the dark red areas are withdrawing a lot more water than is being replenished in the aquifers. And we saw earlier the importance of irrigation for agriculture in India, and it's fueled a lot of the increase in crop production in India that's been required to supply diets. The importance of knowing where your food comes from and where it's being produced is not only about the resource use, but it's also the effects of that resource use. Perhaps it doesn't matter if you require a lot of water and draw a lot of water in an area where there is a lot of water in the aquifers and they're being replenished at a sustainable level. It might be a problem if you're requiring a lot of irrigation in an area where the aquifers are not being replenished at a sustainable rate. But other environmental impacts, it doesn't really matter where they've been produced. So greenhouse gas emissions would be an example. Transport data and trade data can also be used for studies of international footprints or dependencies. So here, this is an example of Carol Dalin's work, looking at groundwater embedded in food products and traded around the world. So you can look at the dependency between different countries. So the consumption that goes on in the United States is drawing on groundwater, for example, in China and in Mexico and so on. Just looking quickly at processing, and again, this is where we're looking at some of the technical aspects in this learning lab. Some of the technical aspects of linking between food systems, the environment, and health. In this case, linking between food systems and the environment. Often when we have production data, we have emissions, for example, or water usage associated with the production of crop items. It will be for a raw crop product, in this case, sunflower seeds. When we have consumption data, we'll have the product as it's consumed. We might have a household consuming a liter of sunflower oil over a week. So one of the methods that's really been necessary in linking between these data sets, one of the methodological developments has been converting between the raw product and the consumed product to actually represent what goes on. And here you might turn, for example, to FAO technical conversion factors, and that can give you an indication at the national level, national average level, of how much oil you get from a kilogram of sunflower seeds, for example. And also these technical conversion factors will tell you about the byproducts you get from that. In this case, cake of sunflower seed, which is an important input for livestock feed. So these conversions are really important, and I think often this is where some of the research is not done, some of the developments have come along more recently, and some of the early research didn't quite factor these conversions in properly. But what you often need to do is not only convert between the raw and the processed product, but take into account and split your emissions, for example, your greenhouse gas emissions between your main product and your byproducts, so that you're not double counting. And you can do that by using the value of the product. So maybe your sunflower oil is 80% of the value of the pressed sunflower seeds, and the cake of the sunflower seeds is 20% of the value. So you split your emissions of the production of sunflower seeds. 80% of your emissions is attributed to the oil and 20% to the sunflower seed cake. Just a quick look now at some of the methods of linking the environment to food system activities in this direction. This is an aerial image of a free CO2 fertilization experiment. A lot of this work has been done over the years at looking at performance of crops in different environments and so on. A lot of it has been tuned towards tweaking crop production environment to maximize yields, for example. But these data can now give us a bit of an idea of what might happen in future scenarios of environmental change. So in this experiment, they would have been injecting CO2 into the immediate environment of the plant and seeing how its growth responds. So there's been lots of this sort of primary data generation going on, sometimes in field experiments, sometimes in glass houses, and so on. The other approach to building up the raw data you need in scenarios analysis is to build models of crop performance. And this is the CropWatt model that FAO have developed over the years. So effectively, this draws together climate, for example, rainfall, rooting depth, soil conditions, soil water balance, and so on, and effectively mimics the environment in which a crop might be growing. And then you can change factors such as what happens if you double irrigation input or halve it, and see how the crop performs. So these models have been tweaked based on primary data, but effectively you can now simulate environmental change with these models for a range of different standardized crops. And that's the sort of data that informs these kind of studies. Here we're looking at percentage change in yields between present and 2050 for a range of 11 major crops, mainly cereals and some legumes. And this is in response to an increase in temperature that we're predicted to experience by 2050. So the crop models are the underlying tool behind this kind of work. I should say this is just looking at temperature. This is not looking at other environmental changes, including, for example, CO2 fertilization. There's also now a recognition, I guess, that we need to draw together all these disparate sources of modeled data and also primary field level or greenhouse type experiments. And there's just about enough evidence to do this now. This is an example here of a systematic review conducted by my colleagues at LSHTM through the Chefs project. Percentage difference in yields of different vegetable crops from for a number of different experiments in response to an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So this kind of systematic review can draw together the evidence and look at the consistencies, but also the inconsistencies between different studies. And that helps to provide the coefficients that link, so that we can link between environmental change and food systems. One of the other reasons why we're trying to integrate across these domains is because we know if we tweak and change one aspect of this triangle, we'll have effects not only in one direction, but in two directions. So if we change something at the food system level, we might have an effect on health, but also on the environment. So we can start to look at what we call trade-offs, so unintended negative effects, or also co-benefits, where we might be able to change something in one area for the benefit of both health and the environment. And here there's been a lot of interest in what we can do in terms of changing diets, both for health and for the environment. And this, again, is a systematic review conducted by one of my colleagues, looking at a huge number of studies conducted almost exclusively in high-income countries. And he's drawn together all the available evidence on what happens if you change your diet from existing dietary patterns to one of a predefined list of potentially lower environmental impact diets. So, for example, vegetarian diet. If everyone in these 20 studies changed their diets from existing patterns to a vegetarian pattern, on average we'd see a 31% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's pretty consistent decline across different study types and so on. Likewise, adopting healthy dietary guidelines would also see co-benefits in terms of emissions, a 12% reduction on average across the different studies, 12% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We found similar things with land use. Adopting a vegetarian diet would incidentally reduce land use by 51%, and adopting healthy guidelines reduce land use by about 20%. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Bahvani. Bahvani is going to look at economics and the set of tools that economics provides to look at the linkages between these different domains.
Edward's laid out a lot of the technical nuances in how we integrate environment into ag nutrition research, the biophysical aspects, all the things that you need to be careful about when measuring things like emissions and how we actually do it through the life cycle and so on. What I'm going to do now is actually put human behavior at the heart of this. And I'm going to talk in the next 15 minutes particularly about the economics way of approaching human behavior in this sphere, and show and discuss how this can be useful, how this enables us to actually look at this research agenda in a sensible way. If you really think about the research that happens in this area, it's all forward-looking. Most of the questions are looking into the future and saying, for example, if I change diets and I move from unhealthy diets currently towards a healthier diet that meets the WHO recommendations, for example, what implications does that have for health? Also, what implications does that have for the environment, greenhouse gas emissions or water footprints or whatever? Or you might have questions that ask about policy changes. Suppose there is a tax, a fat tax applied on a food. What implications does that have for health? What implications does that have for the environment? To answer all these sorts of questions, we need a consistent, reasonable way of expressing human behavior in this dimension. One obvious aspect of human behavior that we need to incorporate here is consumption behavior. So we've got diets, which are a very complex mix of psychology, economics, decision-making about fairly minute things, people consuming hundreds of food products in a week. How will they actually change if they want to move from an unhealthy diet towards a healthier diet? How difficult is it? What are the costs of adjusting to that? What are the directions in which these diets might move? Even for something as simple as, say, meeting the WHO recommendations of 400 grams of fruit and veg per person per day. Now, suppose you're only at 200 grams and you want to move towards 400 grams, there's an infinite number of ways in which you could do it because there are so many different fruit and vegetables which you could consume more or less as you move towards this objective. So how do people actually move? What exactly is the way in which their diets move? So that is, for example, a consumption question that needs to be answered. How do people respond to changes in prices of vegetables and fruits, if you're looking at that particular dimension of the problem? And so we need an incorporation of human behavior in terms of consumption. But that's not all. We also need to understand producer behavior, especially when it comes to integrating environment into this picture of agriculture and health and diets. Because environmental aspects are very intimately related to the production environment in which production takes place. So just to give, for example, if you're producing a particular crop, you could produce it, if you're producing a particular vegetable, let's say, you could produce it in an open field. You might be able to produce it in a glass house, in which case, depending on where you're producing it, the emissions will be very different. Or you might produce it in a particular region and have only local production and consumption, or you might be transporting the food across vast areas, in which case you accumulate transport emissions. As a country, you can think of a decision-making, conceptually you can think of producer decision-making at a country level. Do you produce locally or do you import it? And if you're importing it, is it coming in by shipping or is it coming in by air, which has big implications for the emissions, CO2 emissions in this case. Here's an example. This is actually looking at, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but this is actually the carbon footprint associated with asparagus consumption in Germany, unlikely as that sounds. Now, this is collating information from a variety of studies, and on the x-axis you see the source from which that asparagus is deriving, which country it's coming from, where it's being produced. On the y-axis, you see the CO2 emissions associated with that source. And so the dots that you see there actually show you the CO2 emissions from a particular source. So for example, if you see that on the extreme right corner, you will see that there's German production and German consumption. So the CO2 emissions are pretty low. You're producing and consuming locally. But you see that if you produce it in Switzerland and bring it into Germany, it's not that different. So that's the Switzerland bit over there. But if it's being produced in Morocco and it's coming in from Morocco into Germany, the emissions are a bit higher. But if you're producing it in, say, Mexico or Peru, and you're bringing it in by air, and that happens a lot, obviously, you see the emissions go through the roof. So obviously, production decisions about where, how it's produced, all these things have a profound effect. And unless we have a way of capturing those decisions, at least in a broad way, then we're not capturing the environmental side in a very accurate fashion. So let's just look at the types of research that happens in the sphere where environment is integrated into agriculture nutrition research. There's, first of all, as Edward has described, there's a lot of work around diets, sustainable diets, meeting dietary norms. Currently you have an unhealthy diet, you're moving towards the WHO dietary norms, or maybe you're moving towards a meat-free diet. So people benchmark various ideal diets and then look at where we are currently against that. Sometimes these have no behavioral underpinnings at all, this research. So you just assume that people magically move from where they are currently to consuming these healthy diets. And that is a useful exercise that tells you the benefits potentially of moving towards those healthier diets in terms of environment as well as health. But you have no idea about how you get there, how expensive it is to get there, how costly it is, how easy it is, how hard it is, and so on. There's also a lot of research looking at analyzing shocks to the system. Let's say there's a fat tax which is imposed upon a particular food. What are the environmental implications of that fat tax? Let's say there's a sugar tax or a tax on saturated fats like happened in Denmark. Are there any environmental benefits from moving to a diet as a result of the tax? Not just the health aspect, but also the environmental aspect. So is there an environmental co-benefit from having this fat tax? Now we can see that this kind of research is really powerful because it enables you to compute these double dividends potentially arising from a policy change. You have a health-oriented tax, but perhaps it's also producing environmental benefits. Great. If you can compute that, that's more ammunition to show to policymakers and so on. Look, there's not just a health benefit, there's also an environmental benefit, and it's quite significant. Or there might be an environmental tax, a carbon tax on foods, let's say. And then you ask the question, can we also compute the health benefits of moving towards this environmentally beneficial, diets arising from this environmentally beneficial tax? So these double dividends can be computed. But in order to do that, you need a representation for how people respond to these tax changes. A behavioral aspect needs to be in there. You might have a big technological shock to the system. So what happens as a result of that? You might have a climate-related shock to the system. Let's say you look into scenarios in the future, there's climate change, and there's higher temperatures. That affects the yields of crops in a very uneven fashion around the world, and that has implications for prices, food prices, and that has implications for consumption, and therefore for health. But in order to do that, you need to incorporate behavior into that. What exactly that will translate into in terms of consumption and production. So the behavioral underpinnings of the current research in this agenda are variable. Sometimes they are there, sometimes they are there to a certain extent. So if you look at the sustainable diets kind of work, there's a lot of detailed consumption modeling. There might be, for example, linear programming of diets, which is one way in which you can incorporate behavior into the consumption side. There might be, for example, something that says that people don't deviate from their current diets too much. So can we meet the dietary norms without deviating as little as possible from the current diets? That's another behavioral aspect you can build in. But quite often, even when that is done, the production side is not really, the behavioral aspects of the production side are not necessarily modeled in any great detail. Quite often you find this diet that you're moving towards, and then you multiply it by a average coefficient for greenhouse gases or a water coefficient that might apply to that. And that's how it happens. But we know from that actually paying careful attention to that is important because it can vary a lot depending upon human behavior and decisions that are made. So can we have frameworks that actually bring together the consumption and the producer side that actually look at consumption decision-making and producer decision-making in a consistent fashion so that they all tally with each other and there's explicitly behavior built into these kinds of frameworks? Well, people have been doing that to some extent. There are a couple of different frameworks that we can look at. This is an example using IFPRI's impact model, which is, I can never remember what it stands for. I think it's Integrated Model for Policy Analysis of Agricultural Commodities and Trade. I think that's right. So it's been around for about 50 years now. It's an old workhorse. It's done tremendous things over the years. It's essentially a combination between an economic model, which is the bit you see in green, and a crop and global change type of framework, which you see at the top, and then a water simulator, which you see to the side. And these are all linked together. Within the economic framework, as you can see, there is a demand part to it and there's a supply part to it. The demand aspect is capturing the consumption behavioral, is embedding behavioral consumption aspects into it. The production side is captured in the supply projections, which have an explicit consideration of how producers respond to changes in prices. All that is linked together in terms of trade, international trade. So when domestic prices and international prices are at there's a wedge between them, then there is a change, there's more imports or there's less imports, and all that is consistently computed. There are crop-related information or livestock-related information, technical parameters coming in from the top. There's also scenarios relating to income growth in the future, urbanization, population growth, and so on, which is coming in, which is feeding into this. And when your production changes, there's a simulator relating to water that you can compute. So this is called a partial equilibrium model because it captures in great detail the food sector, but doesn't necessarily capture the rest of the economy's connections with that food sector. So it's partial equilibrium, as economists like to call it. So this is one potential way in which you can approach. You can have an integrated approach to this problem, which has the behavioral underpinnings that you need to compute sensible changes. Let's look at an application of this kind of impact modeling framework in an actual, in practice where environment has been integrated into ag nutrition research. This is work by Marco Springman and colleagues, appeared in the Lancet a couple of years back. They're basically asking the question, if we take typical climate change scenarios over the next 30, 40 years, running into 2050, can we look at how those might change diets and what health implications, diet-related health implications that climate change might have? So that's the question they're trying to answer. So their framework, you can see that methodology at the top, that's basically looking at climate change type information, which is feeding into, which basically gives you the changes in temperature and precipitation going into 2050. That is fed into globally gridded crop models, which are basically telling you what the yield changes will be arising from that. That feeds into the impact model that we've just talked about, which has got all the behavior in it, the production and the consumption, which is basically going to tell you various things. One of the things it tells you is the change in consumption of various foods arising from that. And once you've got the change in consumption, you can convert that into nutrition changes and convert that through an epidemiological model into health changes and mortality that arises from that. So that's the way in which they've approached this. And you can see some of the results here at the bottom. If you just look at this line over here on the left-hand side, that captures the results that they're presenting. Basically, in this example, there are three kinds of broadly most important effects that arise from climate change impacts running into 2050. One is a big impact on food security, less food available, generally speaking, and therefore an increase in undernutrition problems. So that's one negative effect. The second, and very, very significant, is fruit and vegetable consumption, which is disproportionately affected by climate change and has a variety of important linkages into various health effects. And therefore, there is a large negative implication for mortality arising from lowered fruit and veg intakes of various kinds coming from that. But finally, there's also a little bit of a positive movement in the sense that that climate change scenario also results in less meat consumption. And less meat consumption has implications for, again, health and mortality in various ways. And that actually, that reduced meat consumption reduces obesity, but also by itself contributes to fewer deaths in the future. And this picture is actually capturing the overall effects. There's a bunch of positive effects, there's a bunch of negative effects. The bit in sort of grayish blue in the middle, that's the fruit and veg effect. Quite significant number of deaths arising from that. The gray bit at the top of that graph is the undernutrition related mortality that arises. The negative effects at the bottom, the dark blue that you see over there, that is the positive effect arising from reduced meat consumption, the mortality that is reduced as a result of that. And the net effect is the red dot that you see over there, which shows you the net effect, which is about 50,000 more deaths going into 2050. So this is an example of how environment has been integrated into agriculture, food systems, nutrition research, using a partial equilibrium model with behavioral underpinnings, the impact model in this case. Let's look at a slightly different type of model that can be used. It's a general equilibrium model, which is basically not just modeling the food sector, but is connecting the food sector into the overall economy. All the interconnections between agriculture and industry and services and so on, various parts of the overall economy. For example, if you have mortality as a result of, increased mortality as a result of changes in the food systems, then you might potentially have labor supply effects going into other sectors of the economy. Can we capture those sorts of effects? And that's what these bigger models try to do. This is an example coming from a project that I was involved in, looking at palm oil in Thailand. Palm oil, of course, is a very important commodity in Southeast Asia and is economically very important. It provides cheap food in many ways, but the problem is it's high in saturated fat, so there's a potentially negative health impact arising from its consumption. It's also often quite grown in, it's a cause of deforestation and thereby greenhouse gas emissions, loss of biodiversity, and so on. So there are potentially negative environmental effects arising from it as well. So it is quite an important commodity in the scheme of things in Thailand. So we approach this with a general equilibrium model that captures its connections with the entire economy. And we also link that up with epidemiological models relating to health and cardiovascular disease, and also land use arising from oil palm production change. And we looked at various shocks to the system. So at the top you can see a policy shock to the palm oil sector that will feed through into various aspects of this model and will produce a set of results: economic impacts, demographic impacts, environmental impacts, and health impacts. So you can capture the entire economy in this fashion. A simple example of the sorts of policy simulations we do, we look at the effect of a large palm oil sales tax. Right, some commentators in the region have said maybe a palm oil sales tax is a way to go to solve some of the problems associated with oil palm and palm oil production in the region. So we asked the question, what if we have a large sales tax that applies to palm oil? And we run this through the system. We broadly find the following types of results. Household consumption, which the economic effect is substantially lowered. Basically, palm oil, as I said, provides cheap food. When you tax palm oil, that's going to result in more expensive food and lowered consumption. So there's a big economic hit arising from that. There is an improvement in health, not a huge improvement, as a result of improved cardiovascular disease arising from the palm oil sales tax. And the bottom bit is perhaps a surprising one. The environmental effect is actually negative because in Thailand specifically, oil palm actually competes with other agricultural crops rather than with forests. And therefore, it sequesters actually more carbon, oil palm does, than its competitor like rice might. And therefore, when you tax it, there's less oil palm and there's actually less carbon sequestration, so which is an unusual result in this setting. So you can see that these effects are all pulling in different directions, and so that's what that diagram is showing. So there are a couple of big negative effects, there's one relatively positive effect. So my final slide, next one is, suppose we compute these environmental effects, these health effects, these economic effects, and they're all pulling in different directions. Can we go one step further and somehow compare these? How big is this health effect compared to the environmental effect? One might be positive and the other is negative. How do we compare these apples and oranges? So you've got CO2 emissions which are potentially going down, but then you've got a number of lives that are saved, which is a positive effect. How do we compare these? Can we compare these? And as we economists like to say, yes, of course we can. We can do this. We can do this in a slightly controversial way. We can use money as a unifying metric to do that. When you've got these different kinds of effects which are heterogeneous, one way to approach to valuing these is to bring together money as a unifying metric. This is another example. This is also work by Springman and co. They were looking at the effects of dietary change arising from comparing current consumption levels around the world, current diets around the world. What if we moved to a healthy diet by 2050, either a diet that meets healthy eating guidelines, or a diet that is exclusively vegetarian, or a diet that's exclusively vegan? So they look at 3 different diets. They don't have much behavior going on in this work. They just assume that populations will move towards these healthier diets. And then they compute the environmental and health effects of that. The health implications, they run it through an epidemiological model, and the environmental effects, they use life cycle analysis to compute the greenhouse gas emissions arising from these changed diets. And then they use these valuation methods to convert that into money metrics. So you can have, for example, for the environmental effect, you can use the social cost of carbon, which is basically, there's been a lot of research around how you can value carbon emissions, what it actually costs you in terms of various societal outcomes. And there's been a lot of research into that. Based upon that research, you can have a dollar quantity attached to the carbon that is emitted. Likewise, for the health effects, if you have increased mortality, you can have value of life benefits arising from that. So let's say you have so many thousand additional mortality, additional deaths. What does each life, so you can attach a dollar value to each life, which is obviously the controversial part. But you can do that. And there's, again, tons of research in health economics going into this. And then that can get converted into a monetary amount. And there are a couple of ways in which you can do it with health. You can look at the healthcare benefits, like, for example, if there is increased absenteeism at work, you count all those costs, but there's also increased pressure on hospitals, extra costs from healthcare. You can do that as the metric, or you can use the value of life, or you can use a mix of both, and they do both. And so they actually have a schematic where they can compare the dollar amounts associated with environmental benefits with the dollar amounts associated with health benefits arising from these improved diets, and then you can get a measure of the overall benefits. If they're actually pulling in different directions, you'll be able to potentially say, well, I can set this off against this. Overall, I come out in the red or I come out in the black. It depends upon what the results say. But as you can see, it's a way in which you can reconcile these very different effects that are going on. So that's all I have. I'm going to stop there. And I think Edward and I are happy to take any questions, and we'll just open it up for discussion. Thank you.
I believe that the food environment, in addition to the biophysical side, also involves a lot of biological, environmental influences. For example, the inappropriate use of pesticides could be a serious environmental problem in our food system. Another example would be the use of growth regulators to force the ripening of fruits and so on. So please put me on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I should have started with how I was defining environments at the outset. I completely agree with you. A lot of the environments, when we talk about the environment, we might talk about our immediate environment and how that affects our health and well-being and so on. Or we might talk about the wider environments, the natural systems that we rely on for crop production, for example. So yes, I did skip a large part of the research, important research that's going on, looking at how as we change our crop production, for example, or change our livestock production, that's having an effect on the environment that we live in and interact with very immediately. It could be exposure to pesticides would be an example. Air quality, for example, if you live downwind of a intensive livestock production. There are antimicrobial resistance is another area that you could go into. So there's a lot of research going on in that area. Yes, I did. You're right. I did miss that out in my talk, mainly due to time. I'd say that the set of skills required for that kind of research is possibly quite different, and it presents quite different methodological challenges, which is perhaps why I didn't find it easy to fit in this presentation. But thank you for your point.
The question I want to ask is, you're saying money is a unifying metric, but whose money are we using here? Is it government? Is it the global sort of thing? Or are we talking of the household or the individual changing behavior? Because that has implications on how you're going to get people motivated to, to change if money is a, unifying metric. If I'm the one paying for my sins, I might well change my behavior. But if this cost is being borne, the tragedy of the commons, then I'm probably not too motivated. Maybe you might want to address that.
There's a lot of complexity and interdisciplinarity in the search for this unifying approach to the metrics from nutrition, food systems, environment. So I'm just curious, do you see sort of an emerging consensus or emerging consensual patterns of measurement in these things, or are we still dealing with competing models from different fields and disciplines?
There's been a lot of research going on at sort of the biological level of what would be the impact of CO2. And there's real differences between if you have a C3 photosynthetic pathway versus a C4. And actually we've been seeing some of the research on rice and sweet potato imply that the CO2 increases will actually lead to higher yields, substantially higher yields, but that's going to go into the synthetic pathway for more carbohydrates. So we're going to see what people are concerned about is the impact on nutrient density in the crops, that your micronutrient density in these crops may go down even though your yields are going up. And so I know your modeling is already complex, but what are you doing, or are you even looking at the nutrient density issue in the staple foods?
Yes, so I'm just going to address the first question on unifying metrics. Thank you for that. No, that's a really good question. This work is entirely at a population level, so the work that I just described. So it's essentially trying to get the question across to a policymaker or somebody who's interested in outcomes at the population level, at a fairly aggregate level. Can we quantify the environmental benefits and can we quantify the health benefits? And see the extent to which the environmental benefits bolster the health benefits. In cases where they move in opposite directions, then obviously you can arrive at a net figure and so on and have an aggregate representation of that. But clearly, yes, at an individual level, it's quite a different set of questions compared to what might happen at the individual level. So these are purely sort of conceptual questions which work at an aggregate level, but when you sort of try to divide it up at a less aggregate level, then they work less well. So I think that's what you were asking. So correct me if I'm wrong. So I'll pass this on to Ed for the second.
So the second question about consensus, are we seeing consensus building? I think I don't know. I've got two kind of reactions to that. I think yes. To an extent, we're seeing some consensus in terms of the approaches to this kind of research and in terms of the results that we're seeing. Consensus, though, is an interesting term when it comes to science. It doesn't often we're trained, if you like, to challenge consensus, and I think that's going to be perhaps increasingly important, that we don't slip into a trap of assuming that published studies and so on provide all the answers. I think we need to keep a very open mind in this area, both about the approaches that we take to this kind of research and the ways that we go about asking and answering these questions, but also about to what extent we accept as facts what's been published previously. I don't have any particular examples that I'm drawing, and it's just the reaction to the word consensus in that respect. Just on the third question that on nutrient density, there have been a number of studies looking at, and I'm sure you're aware of these studies, looking at the effect of CO2 fertilization on concentrations of important micronutrients in staple foods, also in vegetables and so on, fruits and vegetables. Tends to be the case, as you say, that as the crop grows bigger, it dilutes these important micronutrients. So if you eat your 100 grams of sweet potato every day, you'll be getting less of that micronutrient. But of course, one of my reactions to that is this is what crop breeders have been trying to do for a long time. It's been trying to improve yields, or try to increase yields. And we have seen a decline in micronutrient concentrations as we've moved to high-yielding varieties with larger endosperms in the seeds, for example. So yes, I think it will have an important effect. I don't know what the net effect is, and I think that's going to be really important, trying to integrate the improved yields and potential for improved household incomes as yields increase, alongside the fact that one of their important staple foods is the concentration of micronutrients is declining in that food. So I think it's an interesting area. There's a few studies that have started to look into it in the building into this big kind of macro models, but it probably needs a lot more thought and in terms of how to integrate these findings.